Before we begin, we want to give a massive thank you to Billy Brown for this incredible story request. We took your suggestion and put our own sleep theories spin on it, and what we uncovered during our research genuinely unsettled us. Make sure to leave your own story ideas in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and who knows? Your suggestion might be our next deep dive into the unknown. I need you to understand something before we go any further. I was never one of them. Never the type to see patterns in chaos or hidden hands pulling strings. If anything, I made a career out of dismantling that kind of thinking. For 15 years, I worked as a research analyst for a private intelligence firm, the kind that corporations hire to separate signal from noise, fact from fiction, truth from the conspiracy theories that clog up the internet like arterial plaque. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I did. My specialty was corporate intelligence, tracking disinformation campaigns, identifying coordinated, inauthentic behaviour, debunking viral hoaxes before they could damage a client's reputation. I dismantled everything from elaborate cryptocurrency scams to political astroturfing operations. I had a reputation for being thorough, sceptical, and most importantly, rational. My job was simple: debunk, disprove, dismantle, and I was good at it. Very good. I kept a running tally on a whiteboard in my office. Over 15 years, I debunked over 300 separate conspiracy theories. Everything from the government is putting fluoride in water to control us, to this celebrity death was actually an assassination. Each one fell apart under scrutiny. Each one revealed itself to be exactly what it appeared to be. Pattern-seeking behaviour gone haywire, the human brain's desperate attempt to find meaning in randomness. I'd seen every type of conspiracy theorist there was. The true believers who twist any evidence to fit their narrative. The grifters who knew it was nonsense but profited from it anyway. The mentally unwell who couldn't distinguish between their delusions and reality. I'd catalogued them all, understood their psychology, could predict their arguments before they made them. So when I tell you what I found, understand that I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm simply telling you what happened. The same way I'd report any other finding that crossed my desk. Clinical, factual, unembellished. It started 6 months ago with the most mundane of assignments. A media consulting firm wanted to understand the evolution of public trust in government institutions post-Kennedy assassination. Standard stuff. They were preparing a presentation for a Fortune 500 client worried about reputation management during crisis situations. They wanted historical precedent. How does public trust collapse? And more importantly, how do institutions rebuild it? They wanted data on messaging strategies, public relations pivots, the whole PR, machinery that kicked into gear after November 22nd, 1963. I'd done dozens of these retrospective analyses before, trace the flow of information, identify the key messaging moments, chart the recovery of institutional credibility over time. This should have been easy money. 3 weeks of research, a comprehensive report, invoice sent, on to the next project. I started where any good researcher starts: primary sources, government archives, declassified documents, presidential libraries. The CIA's Freedom of Information Act reading room has thousands of pages available online now, most of it administrative tedium that would bore you to tears. Budget allocations, interdepartmental memos, personnel transfers, the bureaucratic paper trail of empire. I'd requested physical documents too, boxes of material from the National Archives that had been declassified but never digitised. Most researchers don't bother with the physical archives anymore. Everything's going digital, and who wants to spend days in a climate-controlled basement, flipping through yellowed pages when you can search PDFs from your couch? But I'd learned years ago that the important stuff often hides in the boxes nobody opens. The documents deemed too boring to prioritise for digitisation. The files that slipped through classification review because they seemed innocuous. I was 3 weeks into the project when I found it. CIA Dispatch 1035 Reason 960. It was in a box marked Public Affairs Division, Miscellaneous Correspondence 1966-1968. The box had been sitting in my office for 2 days before I got to it. I remember it was raining that afternoon, Thursday, around 3 p.m. I remember because I was thinking about leaving early, maybe catching a movie, doing something normal for once instead of drowning in Cold War paperwork. The document was near the bottom of the box underneath a stack of truly mundane correspondence about budget allocations for Radio Free Europe. Just another memo in a sea of memos, dated April 1st, 1967. The subject line read, "Countering criticism of the Warren Report." I almost skipped past it. Almost. The Warren Report stuff had been done to death. Every researcher who touched the Kennedy assassination ended up swimming through the same material. But something about the clinical precision of the language made me pause. I've read thousands of government documents, and you develop an instinct for the ones that matter. This one had that quality, the carefully chosen words, the deliberate vagueness masking something more specific. The document was marked secret, but had been stamped declassified in 1976, following the Church Committee investigations. Someone had gone through it with a black marker, redacting portions, but most of it was intact. I made a copy and started reading at my desk. By page 12, I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. The uncomfortable awareness that I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see, even though it had been declassified for years. Like finding a letter that wasn't meant for you, but was left where you could find it anyway. The document was a directive sent to CIA stations worldwide. Its purpose was explicitly stated: to provide talking points and psychological tactics for discrediting critics of the Warren Commission's findings on the Kennedy assassination. That part wasn't surprising. Of course, the CIA would want to defend the official narrative. That's basic institutional self-preservation. But it was the language, the specific phrasing, that stopped me cold. Section 3A read, "Employ the term conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists to discredit dissent and cast doubt upon the motives and credibility of skeptics, not as casual slang, not as an organic development of language, as a weapon." The document outlined with surgical precision how to deploy this phrase across media, academic and public discourse. It provided specific grammatical constructions, tonal guidance, even suggestions for facial expressions and body language when dismissing someone as a conspiracy theorist on television. When referring to conspiracy theorists, Section 4 read, "Adopt a tone of mild amusement rather than direct antagonism. The goal is to make the audience associate conspiracy thinking with eccentricity and social awkwardness rather than dangerous radicalism. We want eye-rolling, not fear." There were sample phrases, recommended response templates for different scenarios, a whole appendix on linguistic inoculation, how to use the term preemptively before anyone could raise legitimate questions, creating an environment where questioning itself became socially unacceptable. The most effective deployment is not in response to conspiracy theories, one section noted, but in advance of potential criticism. By establishing conspiracy theorist as a social category before specific criticisms emerge, we create a psychological deterrent. People will self-censor rather than risk being categorized. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my home office. The rain was getting heavier outside. I could hear it drumming against the windows. This had to be overblown. Internet mythology had probably twisted this document into something it wasn't. The conspiracy theory community had probably seized on a mundane PR strategy and inflated it into some grand psychological operation. I'd seen this pattern before. Take a real document, strip away context, add some sinister interpretation, and suddenly you've got proof of whatever grand conspiracy you're selling. Standard conspiracy theorist methodology. That's what I told myself. So I did what I always do. I tried to debunk it. I spent the next week cross-referencing the document, verifying its authenticity through multiple channels, checking the document numbers against CIA archive records. I called a colleague who specialised in Cold War documentation. I compared the typeface and formatting to other verified CIA dispatches from the same period. I examined the declassification stamps and routing numbers. Every verification came back positive. The document was real. authentically produced by the CIA's Covert Action Information Bulletin Division, genuinely distributed to stations worldwide with instructions for implementation. The phrase conspiracy theorist as we know it today, the social death sentence, the conversation ender, the mark of intellectual unseriousness, was engineered, not evolved. Engineered. I checked the Oxford English Dictionary's historical citations. The term conspiracy theory appeared occasionally in the early 20th century, but always in neutral descriptive contexts. Conspiracy theorist as a pejorative barely existed before 1967. I should have stopped there. Should have written my report, collected my fee, moved on to the next project. But something was pulling at me now, a thread I couldn't help but tug. That's always been my problem. Intellectual curiosity that doesn't know when to quit. If they engineered one phrase, what else had they engineered? I started mapping the linguistic evolution of the term conspiracy theorist across media from 1960 to 1970. I had access to newspaper databases, academic journal archives, television transcripts. I wrote a script to scan millions of documents for exact phrases and contextual usage. What I found wasn't just interesting, it was mathematically impossible without coordination. Before 1967, the phrase conspiracy theorist appeared in print exactly 43 times across all major American newspapers in the database. The usage was scattered, inconsistent, and almost always neutral in tone. It was simply a descriptor, like history enthusiast or political commentator. After Dispatch 1035-960, the usage exploded. Within 18 months, it appeared over 2,000 times. Within 5 years, it had become embedded in the common lexicon, spoken with the same reflexive certainty as words like communist or heretic. But the usage pattern was too uniform, too consistent. I'm talking about identical grammatical constructions appearing simultaneously across newspapers that supposedly competed with each other. The same sentence structures, the same tonal implications, the same psychological framing. When the New York Times called someone a conspiracy theorist on March 15th, 1968, they wrote, "Mr. Johnson, like many conspiracy theorists, sees patterns where none exist." When the Washington Post used the term on March 17th, 1968, they wrote, "Like many conspiracy theorists, Henderson sees patterns where none exist." The Los Angeles Times, March 19th. Thompson, like many conspiracy theorists, sees patterns where none exist. The same construction, the same implicit message. These people are seeing things that aren't there. That's not how language works organically. Phrases evolve through variation, regional differences, individual style. When a new term enters common usage naturally, you see divergent usage patterns. Different people using it different ways, the meaning shifting and adapting through use. This was something else. This was uniformity that suggested a style guide, a template, distribution of approved language. I started pulling declassified documents from MKUltra, the CIA's infamous mind control program that officially ran from 1953 to 1973. Most people know the broad strokes: LSD experiments, sensory deprivation, psychological torture masquerading as research, the horror stories of unwitting subjects dosed with hallucinogens, prisoners subjected to weeks of isolation, the search for the perfect truth serum. What most people don't know is that MKUltra wasn't one program. It was 149 sub-projects, many of which have never been fully disclosed. The Church Committee hearings in 1975 revealed some of it, but over 80% of MKUltra documents were destroyed by CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973, just days before he was required to turn them over to investigators. What survived the purge told a different story than the one in popular consciousness. Everyone focuses on the drug experiments, the obvious atrocities. But buried in the surviving documents were references to projects that seemed almost mundane by comparison. Studies of persuasion, linguistic analysis, the psychology of belief formation. Sub-Project 119, for instance, officially described as chemical interrogation research. But when I found the surviving project outline in a university archive, someone's dissertation appendix, ironically enough, it detailed something far more sophisticated than drugs and interrogation. The project focused on what they called semantic emotional hijacking. The researchers had discovered that certain word combinations could trigger involuntary emotional responses strong enough to override rational analysis. They weren't trying to make people believe lies. They were trying to make people incapable of examining certain truths. The difference is crucial. A lie requires maintenance, constant reinforcement, energy. You have to keep repeating it, defending it, adapting it as contradictions emerge. It's exhausting and ultimately fragile. But if you can create a linguistic trigger that makes someone's own brain shut down inquiry before it begins, you don't need to maintain anything. The person maintains their own prison. They become complicit in their own blindness. I found reference to something called limbic capture phrases, word combinations that activate the amygdala faster than the prefrontal cortex can engage. The brain's fear response fires before rational thought can intervene. The technical papers were dense, full of neurological jargon I had to parse slowly. But the core finding was simple. Certain combinations of words could trigger emotional responses that preceded and prevented rational analysis. When you hear these phrases, your brain makes a snap. Judgment, friend or foe, safe or dangerous, credible or crazy, before your conscious mind even fully processes the content. Conspiracy theorist wasn't designed to be an insult. It was designed to be a neurological stop sign. The researchers had tested various phrases to find the most effective triggers. They needed something that would immediately activate social conformity pressure, trigger association with instability and unreliability, make the listener feel intellectually superior for rejecting the labelled person, create emotional distance before rational engagement could occur. Conspiracy theorist hit all 4 markers. I tested this on myself. For the next week, whenever I encountered the phrase in media, I paid attention to my own cognitive response. I watched news programs, read articles, listened to podcasts. Every time someone was labelled a conspiracy theorist, I monitored my internal reaction. Every single time there was a microsecond of hesitation, a tiny pause where my brain seemed to buffer, deciding whether to engage with the content or dismiss it outright. Even when the person being labelled was making reasonable points, even when I consciously tried to evaluate their argument on its merits, there was that split-second judgment, and more often than not my brain chose dismissal. Even knowing what I knew, the trigger still worked. I started testing it on others. Casual conversations with friends. I'd present the same information 2 different ways, once attributed to researchers or investigators, once attributed to conspiracy theorists. The content was identical, only the label changed. The results were consistent. When the information came from researchers, people engaged with it critically, asked questions, considered the evidence. When it came from conspiracy theorists, they dismissed it immediately, usually with a laugh or an eye roll. The label didn't just discredit the information, it made engaging with the information socially awkward. It created an emotional barrier that rational argument couldn't penetrate. That's when I realised I wasn't studying propaganda. Propaganda is crude, obvious, something you can identify and resist once you're aware of it. This was something else entirely. This was neural steering technology, language engineered to exploit the architecture of human cognition itself. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake thinking about all the times I'd used the phrase myself, all the times I'd dismissed someone's argument simply because they'd been labelled. All the potential truths I might have rejected not because they were false, but because the linguistic trigger had fired and my brain had shut down before examination could begin. Operation Mockingbird. Anyone who's spent time in conspiracy theory spaces knows the name. The CIA's program to infiltrate news organisations, recruit journalists, plant stories. It's been acknowledged, documented, even admitted to in congressional testimony by former CIA Director William Colby in 1975. The accepted narrative goes like this. The CIA recruited journalists, paid them for favourable coverage, planted fake stories that served intelligence objectives, crude infiltration, financial leverage, Cold War information warfare. Everyone thinks they understand it. The conspiracy theorists say it proves all media is controlled. The mainstream dismisses it as a relic of a bygone era. Both sides think they know the story, but everyone gets it wrong. I spent 2 months in the National Archives going through boxes of documents from the Church Committee investigations. The Church Committee, officially the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, spent 2 years investigating intelligence abuses. They produced 14 reports totalling thousands of pages. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Receipts, correspondence, the bureaucratic detritus of a covert operation, lists of journalists who'd been on the CIA payroll, payments disguised as consulting fees, articles that had been planted in foreign newspapers and then laundered back into American media as legitimate foreign coverage. Standard stuff, unethical certainly, probably illegal, but conceptually simple. But buried in a supplementary filing, the kind of addendum that gets attached to the official record but rarely read, I found something that didn't fit the accepted narrative. It was a training manual, not for journalists, for linguistic consultants. The manual was dated 1969 and titled Broadcast Stability Architecture, Technical Guidelines for Multi-Network Implementation. It was stamped confidential and marked as an appendix to a larger document that had been heavily redacted or possibly destroyed. What remained was 63 pages of highly technical guidance that read nothing like typical CIA operational documents. It outlined a system for what it called tonal harmonization across news media. The goal wasn't to control what journalists said, it was to control how they said it. The manual went into extraordinary detail. Specific cadence patterns measured in syllables per minute, precise intonation curves graphed on coordinate systems, linguistic anchor phrases that would be embedded in news broadcasts regardless of content. Phrases like experts say, officials confirm, raising questions about, used in specific rhythmic patterns. There were audio waveforms printed on the pages, frequency analysis charts, technical specifications that belonged in an engineering document, not an intelligence manual. The objective is not narrative control, one section read, but cognitive predisposition. We cannot control what people think, but we can optimize the neurological state in which they receive information. A properly calibrated broadcast induces a state of passive receptivity. Critical thinking remains available, but requires conscious effort to activate. I thought I was misreading it at first. It seemed too subtle, too elaborate. Why would anyone go to such lengths? If you wanted to control the news, why not just tell journalists what to say? Why engineer the acoustics and cadence? Then I found the audio analysis. One of the researchers who worked on the Church Committee had kept personal files, not official records, but his own notes and analysis that had bothered him enough that he couldn't let them go. His name was Thomas Weaver. He'd been a sound engineer before becoming a congressional investigator, hired specifically for his technical expertise in audio analysis. His grandson had donated the files to a small university archive in Michigan after Weaver died in 2003. The archive had no idea what they had. The boxes were labelled Personal Papers, Thomas J. Weaver, Government Service. Nobody had requested access to them in over a decade. I drove out there on a weekend. 8 hours from my apartment to the university library's basement archive. I spent 12 hours going through boxes, my back aching from hunching over bankers' boxes in a windowless room that smelled like old paper and mildew. In the third box I found cassette tapes, dozens of them, each labelled with a date and network call sign: NBC, CBS, ABC, BBC, CBC, RAI, NHK. Weaver had recorded evening news broadcasts from 1967 to 1972. 6 networks, same time slot every night. International broadcasts, which seemed odd for someone working on a congressional committee investigating domestic intelligence abuses. But he hadn't just recorded them, he'd analysed them obsessively. His notes were meticulous, almost frightening in their detail. He'd marked specific phrases, measured pauses between words, tracked tonal shifts across different anchors and different networks. He'd printed out oscilloscope readings, frequency spectrum analyses, phonetic transcriptions noting stress patterns and pitch variations. The man had spent years on this. His handwriting became shakier as the dates progressed, the notes more frantic. By 1972, whole pages were covered in calculations and diagrams that looked like the work of someone losing their grip on reality, or someone who'd found something that shattered their grip on what they thought reality was. I found a tape player in the archive's basement storage, an old dual-deck unit that still worked, and started listening. The broadcast sounded normal at first. Walter Cronkite delivering the evening news with his trademark gravitas, David Brinkley's dry wit on NBC, the BBC's received pronunciation formality, just news, just voices reading copy. But then I started following Weaver's notes, listening for what he'd marked. Despite different anchors, different networks, different countries, the speech patterns were identical. Not similar, identical. When Walter Cronkite delivered the news on CBS, and when Alastair Burnett delivered the news on the BBC, they used the same cadence, the same emphatic stress patterns, the same micropauses. Cronkite would say, "The President today, pause 0.4 seconds announced, pause 0.2 seconds, a new policy regarding." Burnett would say, "The Prime Minister today, pause 0.4 seconds announced, pause 0.2 seconds, a new policy regarding." The content was different, the accents were different, but the rhythmic structure was identical. I pulled out more tapes, compared broadcasts from the same day across different networks and countries. The pattern held. News anchors speaking different languages in different countries were using the same prosodic structure, the same melody of speech. Weaver's notes got increasingly technical. He'd measured the pauses, the pitch variations, the amplitude modulations. He'd graphed them, comparing broadcasts across months and years. His final note, dated January 15, 1973, was written in shaky handwriting. "This isn't coordination. This is synchronization. Someone has tuned them, all of them, worldwide, and it's still running. I can hear it every night. They're all speaking in the same voice." Below that, in smaller letters, "I've requested reassignment. They won't let me take these files. I've made copies. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or they've convinced me I'm crazy. Trust the audio. Listen for yourself." I made copies of everything and left. The archive librarian didn't even look up from her computer as I signed out. That night in a motel room, I couldn't stop thinking about what tuned meant. I pulled out the tapes I'd copied and started listening again with headphones, really listening, paying attention not to the words but to everything underneath the words, and that's when I heard it. A tone. So low it was almost subaudible, right at the edge of human hearing, around 18 to 20 hertz. It shouldn't have been there. Broadcast equipment from that era didn't naturally produce frequencies that low. They were filtered out during the recording and transmission process, unless someone deliberately embedded them. I spent the next week teaching myself audio spectrum analysis, downloaded software designed for music production and audio forensics, watched YouTube tutorials on Fourier transforms and frequency analysis, learned to read spectrograms, visual representations of sound across time and frequency. I ran the recordings through the software, visualizing what my ears couldn't quite hear. What I found made my hands shake. Every recording had the same subharmonic layer, a frequency band between 18 and 23 hertz, pulsing in a rhythmic pattern that matched the cadence of speech that existed below conscious hearing. The pattern was identical across every broadcast, every network, every country. Someone had embedded a carrier wave, a subsonic frequency layer that ran underneath the audible content, infrasound. That's the technical term for sound below the threshold of conscious perception. Frequencies below 20 Hz that most people can't consciously hear but that still affect the body and brain. I started researching the physiological effects of infrasound. There's a surprising amount of scientific literature on it. Studies going back to the 1960s, research into industrial noise exposure, natural phenomena like earthquakes and ocean waves, even alleged paranormal experiences. Studies have shown that infrasound at certain frequencies can induce feelings of unease, dread, anxiety. Other frequencies create feelings of awe, calm, trust. The effect is unconscious. You don't hear the sound, but your body responds to it anyway. It's why churches were built with specific acoustics. Organ pipes designed to produce frequencies that induced religious awe. The architecture of cathedrals creating standing waves at precisely calibrated frequencies. People would enter these spaces and feel the presence of something divine, never knowing they were simply responding to acoustic engineering. It's why horror movies use low-frequency sound. That feeling of dread during a scary scene. Half of it is subsonic frequencies you're not consciously hearing. Sound designers have known this for decades. Play a frequency around 19 Hz, and people report feeling uneasy, sensing an invisible presence, experiencing inexplicable fear. The frequency affects the human eye, causing vibrations that can produce peripheral visual hallucinations. It affects the inner ear, creating disorientation. It affects heart rate, breathing patterns, even digestive function. Someone had embedded this into news broadcasts, globally, for decades, not to control what you thought, but to control how you felt while thinking it. I became obsessed. I stopped taking new contracts. My savings started to dwindle, but I didn't care. I'd stumbled onto something vast, something that rewired how I understood the entire media landscape and my place within it. I started acquiring more broadcasts, not just from the 60s and 70s, but from every decade since. I spent thousands of dollars on archived recordings, local news, national news, international broadcasts from dozens of countries, weather reports, financial news, sports coverage. I accumulated hundreds of hours of audio and started running it all through spectrum analysis, the pattern held for news broadcasts. 1967 to present day, the same subharmonic frequency bands appeared in every major news broadcast I analysed. They evolved slightly. The exact frequencies shifted as broadcast technology changed, always staying just below the threshold of conscious hearing, adapting to new transmission standards and digital compression algorithms. But the rhythmic pattern remained constant. Someone had been doing this for 58 years, continuously, adapting to new technology, maintaining the system across generations of equipment and personnel. I expanded my search beyond news, talk shows, documentary narration, presidential addresses, award ceremonies, sports broadcasts, entertainment programming. Nothing. The frequency pattern only appeared in news broadcasts and specific government addresses, State of the Union speeches, emergency broadcasts, addresses to the nation during crises. The system was targeted, precise. It only activated when they needed you in a particular state of receptivity. I started experiencing symptoms I couldn't explain. Insomnia that went beyond normal sleeplessness. I'd lie awake for hours, my mind racing, unable to shut off the analysis. Persistent low-level anxiety that felt like static electricity on my skin. A feeling like I was being watched, even though I knew rationally that was impossible. I'd catch myself staring at walls, losing time. I'd sit down to work and suddenly realise 3 hours had passed and I had no memory of what I'd been doing. My notes would be in front of me, my handwriting, but I couldn't remember writing them. I knew what it was: hypervigilance, paranoia, the natural response to spending months immersed in material that suggested you'd been psychologically manipulated your entire life. I'd seen it before in people who went too deep into conspiracy research. The isolation, the obsession, the gradual erosion of their ability to function normally. But knowing it was paranoia didn't make it go away. If anything, the knowledge made it worse. I couldn't tell which of my thoughts were my own and which were responses to stress and sleep deprivation. I found references in the MKUltra documents to something called acoustic cognitive manipulation. Most of the files were destroyed, but I pieced together enough from surviving fragments and cross-references to other projects. They'd been testing whether specific sound frequencies could alter cognitive states without conscious awareness, whether you could make someone more suggestible, more compliant, more resistant to cognitive dissonance. whether you could induce specific emotional states that would make people more likely to accept certain types of information and reject others. The answer was yes. And then I found the paper trail showing that researchers from these projects had been hired as consultants by major broadcasting networks throughout the 1970s and 1980s, not listed as CIA, not listed as government contractors, listed as audio engineering specialists and broadcast technology consultants. I found their names in old industry publications, articles about innovations in broadcast technology, technical papers on signal processing and acoustic optimization. They were presented as pioneers, visionaries who were advancing the science of mass communication, but their backgrounds were CIA. Their funding came from defense contractors with intelligence community connections. Their research had been conducted in MKUltra subprojects. The network wasn't infiltrated from outside, it was built with them inside from the beginning. I was 6 months into this research when I found the first reference to something called the Sentiment Index. It appeared in a footnote in a 1981 National Security Council briefing document that had been declassified in 2015. The full briefing was about domestic counter-terrorism preparedness following the Iranian hostage crisis, discussing methods for identifying potential threats among domestic populations. Most of it was standard stuff: monitoring foreign nationals, tracking communications patterns, predictive modelling based on known radical networks. But this single footnote, easily overlooked, mentioned cross-referencing potential ideological threats via sentiment index scoring, with particular attention to high variance outliers. High variance outliers, a statistical term, not the language typically used in intelligence briefings. I spent 3 weeks trying to find any other reference to the sentiment index. Nothing in the CIA archives, nothing in the NSA documents released by Edward Snowden, nothing in any official database I could access. The phrase appeared nowhere else. It was as if someone had let it slip into one document and then carefully scrubbed it from everything else. Then I got lucky. I was searching through used bookstores online, looking for technical memoirs from defense researchers. Sometimes people publish their recollections years after the fact, after classification expires, or they stop caring about NDAs. These books usually vanish without notice. Small print runs, minimal marketing, mostly purchased by specialised collectors and researchers. I found a memoir by a former DARPA researcher named James Aldrich, published in 2008 by a small university press. The book had terrible reviews on Amazon. Readers complained it was dry, technical, self-aggrandizing, perfect. Those were exactly the books nobody read, but that sometimes contained accidental admissions. I found a used copy on eBay for $4. Most of it was exactly what the review suggested. Dry technical reminiscence about early computer networking and defense projects, written in the self-congratulatory tone of someone convinced they'd changed the world. But Chapter 7 was called The Classification Problem. Aldrich described a project he'd worked on in the early 1980s at DARPA's Behavioural Science Division. They were attempting to develop predictive models for what he called neurological compliance variability. The project's goal was simple: understand why some people accepted official narratives without question, while others instinctively questioned them. They started with political orientation, assuming it was ideological. But the data didn't support that. Both liberals and conservatives showed identical distributions of compliance and skepticism. Education level didn't predict it. Neither did socio-economic status, religious affiliation, or cultural background. Whatever factor determined whether someone accepted or questioned authority, it transcended traditional demographic categories. So they went deeper. Neurological testing, brain scans, cognitive function, assessments. They studied hundreds of subjects, analysing their brains while presenting them with various types of information, some from official sources, some from alternative sources, some completely fabricated. What they discovered surprised them. It wasn't about intelligence. High IQ individuals appeared in both groups. It wasn't about critical thinking skills. Both groups were equally capable of analysing information when they chose to engage with it. It was neurological architecture. They discovered that human brains could be roughly categorised into two types: based on how they processed authority-derived information. Aldrich called them Type A and Type B cognitive architectures. Type A brains treated information from official sources as automatically credible, requiring significant contradictory evidence to reject it. Their default position was trust. When presented with an official statement, their brains showed increased activity in areas associated with reward and social bonding. Accepting official information felt good. Questioning it created cognitive stress. Type B brains treated all information with equal skepticism, requiring positive evidence to accept anything. Their default position was doubt. When presented with an official statement, their brains showed increased activity in areas associated with threat detection and analytical processing. Questioning felt natural. Accepting without verification created cognitive dissonance. Neither type was superior, they were just different. Evolution had probably selected for both. Communities needed some people who trusted authority for social cohesion and others who questioned it for adaptability and innovation. But from a governance perspective, they required different management strategies. Type A individuals could be governed through traditional authority structures. They wanted to believe the official narrative. They experienced psychological comfort from conformity. Type B individuals were harder to govern, not because they were rebellious or contrarian by nature, but because their brains literally processed information differently. They couldn't just accept something because an authority figure said it. Their neurology demanded verification. Aldrich described how they had developed a scoring system, a way to predict which category someone fell into based on linguistic analysis of their written and spoken communication. Patterns in word choice, sentence structure, the types of questions they asked, how they responded to authority cues in conversation. They called it sentiment indexing. The chapter ended with Aldrich noting that the project was discontinued in 1984 due to ethical concerns about potential applications and insufficient funding for continued research. But I found a paper trail suggesting it wasn't discontinued, it was privatised. Aldrich left DARPA in late 1984 and founded a small tech company called Cognitive Metrics Incorporated in 1985. The company's stated purpose was advanced linguistic analysis for corporate market research. Innocuous, boring, the kind of startup nobody pays attention to. That company was acquired by a larger defence contractor called Synaptic Solutions in 1989. That contractor was absorbed by an even larger telecommunications corporation, Global Com Industries, in 1996. The technology didn't disappear, it metastasized into the private sector where oversight was minimal and applications were unlimited. I started finding references in telecommunications patents from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Algorithms for real-time sentiment analysis, predictive engagement modelling, cognitive response forecasting, neural compliance scoring. The language was corporate and sterile, but the underlying technology was the same. Systems designed to categorize human beings based on their neurological compliance patterns. Patent after patent, filed by subsidiaries of companies that traced back to that original DARPA research. The technology had evolved, adapted to the internet age, integrated with social media platforms and search engines. And then I understood what I was really looking at. The term conspiracy theorist was never meant to convince anyone of anything. It was a marker, a flag, a way to identify people whose brains were neurologically resistant to authority-based consensus. It was a diagnostic reading. The system wasn't trying to silence these people. It was trying to catalogue them, track them, monitor their spread and influence, map the network of Type B cognitive architecture across the population. Because if you're engineering consensus reality, you need to know who's immune to the engineering. You need to know where the resistance is, not to crush it necessarily, but to contain it, to isolate it, to make sure it doesn't spread beyond acceptable thresholds. The conspiracy theorists weren't the enemy, they were the control group. Everything accelerated after I made that connection. I started finding recent evidence, not historical documents, but active systems currently in operation. Patent filings from major tech companies describing narrative stability algorithms and consensus reinforcement architecture. These weren't theoretical papers or research proposals. These were patents for deployed technology, systems already running in production environments. I found architecture documents leaked by former employees, posted anonymously on obscure forums. Technical specifications for content recommendation systems that didn't just show you content you'd like. They showed you content that would move your sentiment index score toward a predetermined target range. Not toward truth, toward stability. The algorithms analysed your browsing history, your social media engagement, your search queries. They built a psychological profile. They calculated your compliance score, and then they curated your information environment to keep you within acceptable parameters. If you were type A, strongly compliant, the system would occasionally expose you to controlled dissent, just enough to make you feel like you were seeing multiple perspectives, but never enough to actually destabilise your worldview. If you were type B, naturally sceptical, the system would do something more sophisticated. It would show you conspiracy theories, lots of them, but it would mix legitimate questions with obvious nonsense. It would show you flat earth theories alongside genuine investigative journalism. It would make sure that when you tried to share what you'd learned, you'd sound crazy. The system wasn't suppressing dissent, it was managing it, containing it, making sure it stayed within acceptable boundaries. I discovered that 6G telecommunications infrastructure being deployed in test markets included features that went far beyond anything publicly discussed. I found technical specifications, leaked implementation guides, internal memos from telecom companies. Embedded in the technical specifications were references to cognitive load optimization and real-time sentiment adjustment. The infrastructure wasn't just for faster downloads. It was designed as a two-way system, receiving data about user behavior and transmitting signals optimized for neurological response. The technology had evolved beyond embedded frequencies in broadcasts. Now it was interactive, responsive, adaptive. Artificial intelligence systems were monitoring aggregate sentiment across social media, news consumption patterns, search queries. When the AI detected narrative instability, when too many people started questioning the same thing, it would automatically trigger what the documents called preemptive reframing protocols. Not censorship, something worse, narrative preemption. The system would inject counter-narratives into the information stream before critical mass could form. It would algorithmically suppress certain types of content not by banning it, but by making it invisible, reducing its reach, removing it from recommendations, burying it in search results. And it would do this automatically in real time without any human decision-making involved. The system was optimizing for stability, not truth, and it had been given the autonomy to decide what stability looked like. I started documenting everything in encrypted files with multiple backups. Cloud storage, physical drives, copies sent to secure email accounts. I knew I needed to get this information out, but I wasn't sure how. Who would I send it to? Journalists? They were part of the system. Politicians? Even worse. Anonymous leaking platforms? Probably monitored. I decided to compile everything into a comprehensive report first. Get all the evidence organised, create a clear timeline, make it undeniable. That's when things got strange. I was working late one night around 2 a.m. typing up a section about the sentiment index. I had the television on in the background, a habit from my old research days, always having news playing, monitoring the patterns even while I worked. I heard the anchor say something that made me freeze. I'd just typed a phrase, a very specific phrase I'd coined myself, to describe the preemptive reframing protocols, something I'd never said aloud, never written anywhere except in my private notes. I'd just invented it, literally 30 seconds earlier, and the news anchor had just said it, word for word. Cognitive narrative preemption, she said, is becoming a concern for privacy advocates, my exact phrase. The exact unusual word combination I'd just typed for the first time. I rewound the broadcast on my DVR, watched it again. She was talking about social media policy, something about content moderation. But in the middle of her sentence, she used my exact phrase, the exact terminology I'd invented moments before. Coincidence. Had to be. Except it kept happening. Over the next 3 days, I tested it deliberately. I'd write unique phrases, combinations of words that had never appeared together before, neologisms that couldn't possibly exist in any database. I'd type them in my notes. Within hours, sometimes minutes, I'd hear them on television or see them in news articles that were supposedly published before I'd written them. My notes started changing too. I'd write a paragraph, save the document, step away from my computer, come back an hour later, and the paragraph would be slightly different. Just a word or two altered. The meaning shifted subtly. I started keeping handwritten backups in a locked safe, convinced my computer was compromised. The handwritten notes changed too. I'd write something down, lock it in the safe, leave my apartment. When I'd return and check, sentences I didn't remember writing would appear. My handwriting, but thoughts I'd never had. Conclusions that contradicted my research. I stopped sleeping in my apartment, started staying in hotels, different one each night, paying in cash. I'd write my notes, photograph them with a camera that had no wireless capability, hide the physical notes in different locations. It didn't help. The television in whatever hotel room I was in would respond to my research. Not obviously. Not in ways I could prove to anyone. Just synchronicities that became impossible to ignore. I'd be reading about Operation Mockingbird, and a commercial would come on for a documentary about Cold War espionage. I'd be analysing audio frequencies, and the hotel's background music would shift to tones that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I'd spent too long staring into this. Maybe the paranoia had metastasized into something clinical. Maybe everything I thought I'd discovered was just pattern recognition gone haywire, my brain finding connections that didn't exist. But then I found the final piece. I was searching through a patent database at 4 a.m. in a library parking lot, using their Wi-Fi from my car, when I found a patent filed in 2023 by a subsidiary of a major tech corporation. The patent was titled Dynamic Environmental Narrative Adjustment Through Individualized Content Modification. I read the abstract 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. It described technology for altering digital information in real time based on individual user behavior and neurological compliance scoring. Not just recommendations, actual content. The words in articles, the sentences in documents, video and audio files, everything adjustable, everything responsive to what the system determined you needed to see to maintain your specific cognitive stability. The patent explicitly stated that the technology could maintain narrative stability by presenting individually tailored information environments that prevent destabilizing cognitive dissonance in users identified as high risk for consensus departure. In other words, everyone sees a slightly different internet, a slightly different news broadcast, a slightly different reality, customized, optimized, controlled. Not to deceive you with lies, but to prevent you from ever encountering truths that would destabilize your current belief structure. The system wasn't hiding information. It was making sure you never wanted to look for it in the first place. And if you did start looking, if you started exhibiting narrative instability, if your sentiment index score moved outside acceptable parameters, the system would adjust your information environment in real time to guide you back toward consensus reality. Or if you couldn't be guided back, it would isolate you. Make sure that what you discovered seemed too crazy to believe. Make sure you sounded paranoid even to yourself. Make sure that when you tried to share what you'd learned, you'd use phrases and make connections that would trigger the conspiracy theorist label in everyone who heard you. The system would make you its own best discrediting agent. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of my car. I looked exhausted, unhinged, wild-eyed, exactly like someone who'd gone too far down a rabbit hole and lost all perspective, exactly like a conspiracy theorist. And that's when I finally understood the full genius of it. The term wasn't just a weapon to discredit dissent, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy, a trap that tightened the more you struggled against it. The moment you started to see the system made sure you looked crazy for seeing it. Not by discrediting the information itself, but by discrediting you, by making you exhibit the exact behaviours that would make others dismiss you. Paranoia, hypervigilance, isolation, obsession, connecting things that seemed unconnected, seeing patterns everywhere, speaking in urgent tones about things nobody else could see, all natural responses to discovering you've been manipulated, all symptoms that make you look unstable. The people who saw through the system were automatically marked by their own awakening. Their awareness became their prison. The more they understood, the crazier they appeared. The more evidence they gathered, the more they looked like they'd lost touch with reality. Because consensus reality was engineered. And anyone who saw past the engineering automatically stood outside consensus. The trap was perfect. I'm writing this in a location I won't specify. I don't know how much time I have before this becomes unavailable to me, either because I'm prevented from sharing it, or because I prevent myself from sharing it. I can feel my certainty wavering. The evidence is overwhelming, but my confidence in my own perception is eroding. That might be sleep deprivation. Or it might be exactly what's supposed to happen when someone with a Type B cognitive architecture pushes too far past acceptable parameters. Maybe I'm being actively managed right now. Maybe every word I'm typing is being monitored, analysed, categorised. Maybe this document will be allowed to exist because it serves the system. Another conspiracy theory that makes anyone who takes it seriously look unhinged. Or maybe I've simply gone crazy. Maybe months of isolation and obsessive research have broken something in my brain. Maybe I'm experiencing some kind of paranoid break and none of this is real. I can't tell anymore. That's the most terrifying part. I can no longer trust my own mind. But I need to be clear about what I've actually verified versus what I've inferred. Verified. CIA Dispatch 103-960 is real and explicitly instructs agents to weaponize the term conspiracy theorist. The phrase's media usage exploded with mathematical impossibility after 1967. Without apparent coordination, MKUltra included sub-projects researching linguistic emotional manipulation and acoustic cognitive effects. Operation Mockingbird placed intelligence assets in news organisations. News broadcasts from 1967 forward contain identical subharmonic frequency patterns that shouldn't exist naturally. Major tech companies hold patents for sentiment analysis and narrative adjustment technology. Real-time content modification systems are deployed and operational. The technology for individualized reality presentation exists and is patented inferred. These elements are connected rather than coincidental. The connection represents intentional and ongoing psychological manipulation. The system is automated and continues to operate. My own information, environment is being actively modified. I cannot prove the second category. I can only show you the architecture and let you decide if the pattern is real or if I've constructed meaning from chaos. But here's what I know with absolute certainty. My information environment has been changing in response to this research. Whether that's because I'm being actively monitored or because I've become hyper-aware of things that were always there, the effect is the same. I can no longer trust my own perception. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the goal was never to make everyone believe the same thing. Maybe it was to make sure that anyone who saw past the consensus reality could be isolated, not by force, not by obvious suppression, but by making them unreliable witnesses, by making them sound exactly like the stereotype that was engineered to discredit them. The term conspiracy theorist was never meant to silence believers. It was designed to isolate the unprogrammable, the people who couldn't be tuned, the ones whose neurological architecture made them resistant to consensus engineering, the Type B brains who needed evidence instead of authority. They needed to be identified, catalogued, contained, not eliminated. That would be too obvious, too crude, just isolated, made socially uncomfortable, marked with a label that would make others dismiss them automatically. And the beautiful part, the truly elegant part, is that the label is self-applied. The system doesn't call you a conspiracy theorist. Your own awakening does. Your own pattern recognition. Your own inability to stop seeing what you've seen. You label yourself by the simple act of noticing. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if this will reach anyone, or if it reaches you in the form I intended, or if by the time you read this the words will have shifted to say something else entirely. I don't know if I'll wake up tomorrow and decide none of this matters, that I was chasing shadows, that I should delete everything and return to my normal life. I don't know if that decision will be mine, or if it will be the system guiding me back towards stability. I can't trust my future self any more than you can trust me right now. The only advice I can offer is this: pay attention to what you're not allowed to question. Pay attention to what makes you uncomfortable to even consider. Pay attention to the thoughts that your own brain tries to shut down before you can fully form them. That's not necessarily evidence of truth, but it's evidence of engineering. And if the architecture is real, and I believe I've shown that it is, then somewhere someone decided what you were allowed to see, what questions you were allowed to ask, what conclusions you were allowed to reach. The question you have to answer is why? What are they protecting? What are they hiding? Or maybe more accurately, what are they preventing you from becoming? Because maybe the real secret isn't what they're hiding from you. Maybe it's what they're preventing you from discovering about yourself, about your own capacity for independent thought, your own ability to see past engineered consensus, your own potential to exist outside the system they've built. Maybe that's what they fear most. Not that you'll learn their secrets, but that you'll learn you don't need their reality at all. I'm going to try to sleep now, for the first time in weeks. I don't know if I'll wake up as the same person who wrote this. I don't know if these files will still exist tomorrow, or if they'll have changed into something else, something safer, something more acceptable. I don't know if you're reading what I actually wrote, or some modified version designed to keep you stable. I don't know anything anymore, except that the question matters more than the answer. Keep asking it, even when, especially when, everything tells you to stop. The term was never meant to silence believers. It was designed to isolate the unprogrammable. And if you're still reading this, still questioning, still refusing to accept the easy answers, then maybe you're one of us. Maybe you always were. This has been a Sleep Theory's original story. If you made it this far, thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. We know it was unsettling. That was the point. Whether you believe any of this or not, we hope it made you think. We hope it made you question. We hope it reminded you that reality is always more complex than it appears. Please leave your own story suggestions in the comments below. We love hearing from you, and your idea could be our next investigation. Until then, sleep well, if you can. Good evening, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious about you, our listeners. How has your day been treating you? Are you winding down after a long day? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world, just beginning your morning routine. What time is it where you are right now, and what corner of our vast planet are you calling home tonight? Whether you're listening from a bustling city apartment, a quiet countryside home, or somewhere in between, you're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new to Sleep Theories, welcome aboard. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have so many more mysteries to uncover together, and your subscription helps us bring these stories to light. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous disasters. Tonight, we're going beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, not just to explore the wreckage of a legendary ship, but to uncover a conspiracy so massive, so carefully orchestrated, that it may have shaped the course of world history. This is the story of the Titanic switch, The theory that suggests the ship that sank on that fateful April night in 1912 was never the Titanic at all. April 14th, 1912. Picture this night in your mind. The North Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, a black mirror reflecting nothing but stars. There is no moon to illuminate the waters, leaving the ocean in an almost supernatural darkness. The temperature has dropped to just below freezing, and the sea is unusually calm, so still that veterans of these waters would later describe it as eerily unnatural. Cutting through this obsidian expanse is the largest moving object ever created by human hands. The RMS Titanic, all 882 feet of her, pushes through the water at nearly 23 knots. Her 4 massive smokestacks pierce the star-filled sky, sending columns of smoke and sparks into the night. From her decks, the warm glow of electric light spills out onto the water, creating the only source of illumination for miles in any direction. Inside this floating palace, over 2,000 souls are living what many believe to be their final hours, though they don't know it yet. In the first-class dining saloon, passengers in evening wear are finishing their 10-course dinner, completely unaware that they are dining aboard what will become history's most famous maritime disaster. The ship's orchestra plays ragtime melodies that drift through the corridors, mixing with the sound of laughter, conversation, and the ever-present thrumming of the engines deep below. Captain Edward Smith stands on the bridge, a veteran of the seas with 40 years of experience behind him. This is meant to be his final voyage before retirement, a triumphant capstone to a distinguished career. He has commanded ships for the White Star Line for decades, earning the nickname Millionaire's Captain for his skill in handling the luxury vessels that carry the world's elite across the Atlantic. Tonight he commands not just any ship, but the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet, the unsinkable Titanic. But at 11:39 p.m. ship's time, everything changes in an instant. Frederick Fleet, the lookout stationed in the crow's nest, spots something emerging from the darkness ahead. Without the aid of binoculars, which, mysteriously, are locked away and unavailable to the lookouts that night, he strains his eyes against the blackness. What he sees sends ice through his veins. A massive iceberg, dark and silent, looms directly in the ship's path. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet shouts into the telephone that connects him to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch receives the warning and immediately orders hard a starboard and full astern. The helmsman spins the wheel, and the engine room receives the telegraph signal to reverse engines. For 37 seconds, the fate of over 2,000 people hangs in the balance as the massive ship begins to turn. But it's too late. The Titanic's starboard side scrapes along the iceberg with what survivors would later describe as a sound like thunder, though to many passengers it felt like nothing more than a slight shudder. Some passengers on the lower decks report chunks of ice falling onto the deck, and a few even gather pieces as souvenirs, joking about their close call with the ice. They have no idea that their ship is already doomed. Below the waterline, the iceberg has opened up the first 5 compartments of the ship's hull. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but 5 is too many. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who is aboard for this maiden voyage, quickly calculates the mathematics of disaster. With 5 compartments flooding, the ship will inevitably sink by the bow, pulling the rest of the vessel down with her. "How long do we have?" Captain Smith asks Andrews. "An hour, 2 at most." And so begins one of the most studied, documented and debated disasters in human history. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the unsinkable ship will break apart and slip beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,500 souls. The survivors will tell stories of heroism and cowardice, of the band playing hymns as the ship tilted toward her grave, of the insufficient lifeboats and the icy water that killed most victims within minutes. This is the story we all know. This is the official narrative that has been told and retold for over a century. But what if everything we think we know about that night is wrong? What if the ship that struck the iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic was never the Titanic at all? What if the real conspiracy began not in the aftermath of the disaster, but months before, in the shipyards of Belfast, where 2 sister ships sat side by side, and where a desperate plan was hatched to save a failing company from financial ruin, what if the disaster that shocked the world was not an accident, but the culmination of the most audacious insurance fraud ever attempted? Tonight, we're going to explore a theory that suggests the Titanic disaster was not just a tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the world. We're going to examine evidence that points to a massive cover-up, one that may have claimed the lives of over 1,500 innocent people in service of greed, power, and political manipulation. This is the story of the Titanic switch, and by the end of our journey together, you may never look at this famous disaster the same way again. To understand the theory of the Titanic switch, we must first travel back to the shipyards of Belfast, Ireland, where two virtually identical ships were taking shape side by side. The story begins not with disaster, but with dreams of maritime supremacy and the fierce competition between the great shipping lines of the early 20th century. Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast was, at the time, one of the premier shipbuilding facilities in the world. The massive facility sprawled along the banks of the River Lagan, its enormous gantry cranes towering over the landscape like steel monuments to industrial ambition. It was here, in this cathedral of steel and rivets, that the White Star Line had commissioned 3 ships that would change ocean travel forever. The Olympic-class ships, as they would be known, were conceived as the ultimate expression of luxury and engineering prowess. These were to be the largest, most opulent vessels ever built, designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic passenger route and crush the competition from rival shipping companies like Cunard Line. The first of these sister ships was the RMS Olympic, launched on October the 20th, 1910. She was a marvel of engineering, stretching 882 feet from bow to stern and weighing over 46,000 tons. Her 9 decks could accommodate over 2,000 passengers in unprecedented luxury, with amenities that included a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a Turkish bath, and dining rooms that rivaled the finest restaurants in London or New York. The Olympic was not just a ship. She was a floating city, a testament to British engineering and a symbol of the White Star Line's dominance of the seas. When she departed Southampton on her maiden voyage in June 1911, she carried with her the hopes and reputation of her builders. But less than 4 months after her maiden voyage, disaster struck. On September the 20th, 1911, the Olympic was departing Southampton when she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser. The impact was devastating. The Hawke's reinforced bow, designed to ram enemy vessels, punched a massive hole in the Olympic's starboard side, flooding 2 of her compartments and severely damaging her propeller shaft. The Olympic limped back to port, her maiden voyage season cut dramatically short. But the damage was far more extensive than initially apparent. When she was dry docked for inspection, the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. The collision had not only opened up her hull and damaged her propeller, but it had also twisted her keel, the backbone of the ship, potentially compromising her structural integrity for the remainder of her operational life. For the White Star Line, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. The Olympic had cost over $7.5 million to build, an astronomical sum in 1911. Now she faced months of expensive repairs, and even after those repairs, questions would remain about her seaworthiness and insurability. But the problems went deeper than just the cost of repairs. The collision with HMS Hawke had occurred under circumstances that placed the Olympic at fault. Captain Edward Smith, yes, the same Captain Smith who would later command the Titanic on her fatal voyage, had been in charge of the Olympic when the accident occurred. The subsequent Admiralty Court inquiry found the Olympic to blame for the collision, meaning that the White Star Line would receive no insurance compensation for the damage. This left the company facing a nightmare scenario. They had an expensive ship that needed costly repairs, no insurance money to pay for those repairs, and serious questions about whether insurance companies would be willing to fully cover the vessel in the future. The Olympic had gone from being the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet to a massive financial liability virtually overnight. Meanwhile, in the same Belfast shipyard where the Olympic was undergoing her repairs, work was proceeding on her sister ship, the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was planned to be virtually identical to her older sister, with only minor modifications and improvements. From a distance, even expert ship observers would have difficulty telling the two vessels apart. They shared the same basic dimensions, the same general layout, the same distinctive four-funnel silhouette that had become the signature of the White Star Line's premium vessels. This similarity, according to the switch theory, was not coincidental. It was the key to a plan that would solve the White Star Line's financial crisis, while simultaneously eliminating a massive liability. The theory suggests that sometime in late 1911 or early 1912, a decision was made at the highest levels of the White Star Line's ownership. Rather than spend millions repairing the Olympic and then operating her under a cloud of doubt about her structural integrity and insurability, they would swap the identities of the two ships. The damaged Olympic would be given the identity of the Titanic and sent out on what was ostensibly the new ship's maiden voyage. But this voyage would not be intended to reach New York. Instead, the disguised Olympic would be deliberately sunk, allowing the White Star Line to collect the full insurance value of a new undamaged vessel while simultaneously eliminating the financial burden of the real Titanic's damaged sister. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would quietly slip into service, her true identity hidden from the world. To understand why such a plan might have been attractive, we must consider the financial pressures facing the White Star Line in 1912. The company was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had invested enormous sums in his shipping empire, but the business was facing increasing competition and declining profitability. The White Star Line needed the Titanic to be a success. They needed her to capture public imagination, dominate the headlines, and establish the company's supremacy on the North Atlantic route. But they also needed to resolve the Olympic problem before it bankrupted the entire operation. According to the switch theory, the solution was as elegant as it was terrible. Switch the ships, sink the damaged one while pretending it was the new one, collect the insurance money, and use the real new ship to rebuild the company's reputation and finances. The theory suggests that the work done on both ships during the winter of 1911 and 1912 was not routine maintenance and completion, but rather an elaborate process of swapping their identities. Features that differed between the ships would need to be altered. Documentation would need to be changed or destroyed. Most importantly, the workers involved would need to be either brought into the conspiracy or kept unaware of what they were truly doing. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers, and the shipyard was a maze of activity with multiple vessels under construction and repair simultaneously. In such an environment, it would be possible to make alterations to both ships without arousing suspicion, especially if the changes were explained as routine modifications or improvements. The workers who might notice discrepancies could be told they were simply upgrading the Olympic to match improvements made to the Titanic design, or vice versa. Only a handful of people at the very top of the hierarchy would need to know the true purpose of the work being done. But for such a plan to succeed, it would require more than just physical alterations to the ships. It would require careful planning of the disaster itself, ensuring that the right people were aboard and the right people were not, and that the sinking would occur in circumstances that would prevent too close an examination of the evidence. The switch theory suggests that every detail of the Titanic's maiden voyage was planned not to showcase a magnificent new ship, but to destroy an old damaged one while making it appear to be an accident. The passenger list, the route, the timing, even the crew assignments, all of these, according to the theory, were carefully orchestrated to serve the conspiracy. As we'll see, the evidence for this incredible claim goes far beyond simple speculation. There are photographs that seem to show differences between the ship that left Belfast and the ship that left Southampton. There are testimony from shipyard workers who noticed unusual modifications being made. There are suspicious cancellations by wealthy passengers who had every reason to want to be aboard the maiden voyage of the most famous ship ever built. Most tellingly, there are the financial motivations of the men who controlled the White Star Line. Men who stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and who stood to gain millions if a carefully planned disaster could eliminate their problems while simultaneously collecting insurance payments. But before we examine that evidence, we need to understand exactly who these men were and just how much money was at stake in 1912. We need to understand the insurance motive that may have driven over 1,500 people to their deaths in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Money. In the end, according to the switch theory, that's what the Titanic disaster was really about. Not the romance of the sea, not the hubris of calling a ship unsinkable, not even the class divisions that the disaster seemed to highlight. It was about money. Enormous amounts of money that stood to be lost or gained depending on the fate of two ships and the decisions of a few powerful men. To understand the financial pressures that may have driven the conspiracy, we need to understand the business empire of one man, John Pierpont Morgan, the American financier who controlled more wealth and power than perhaps any individual in the history of capitalism. J.P. Morgan was not just wealthy, he was a force of nature in the world of early 20th century finance. His banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, had financed railroads, steel companies, and industrial empires. He had personally intervened to prevent financial panics, earning him the nickname America's Bank. When the federal government needed money, they came to J.P. Morgan. When major corporations needed capital, they came to J.P. Morgan. By 1912, he controlled assets worth billions in today's currency. But Morgan's empire was not limited to American shores. In 1902, he had founded the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust designed to dominate transatlantic passenger and cargo traffic. The IM acquired control of numerous shipping lines, including the prestigious White Star Line, Morgan's crown jewel in maritime transportation. The White Star Line was the perfect fit for Morgan's vision. Founded in 1845, it had built its reputation on providing luxury service to affluent passengers crossing between Europe and America. The company's ships were known for their elegance, comfort and safety record. When Morgan acquired control, he saw an opportunity to create the ultimate expression of luxury travel while generating enormous profits. This vision led directly to the commissioning of the Olympic-class ships. Morgan intended these vessels to be more than just transportation. They would be floating advertisements for the supremacy of his shipping empire. The Olympic, Titanic and the planned third sister ship Britannic would capture the public imagination and establish IMM as the unquestioned leader in North Atlantic travel. The financial investment was staggering. Each ship cost approximately $7.5 million to build, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The Olympic alone represented an investment larger than the annual budget of many small nations. For the three ships combined, Morgan was risking an amount of money that could have funded a small war. But the potential profits were equally enormous. The North Atlantic passenger route was one of the most lucrative transportation businesses in the world. Wealthy Americans travelling to Europe for business or pleasure were willing to pay premium prices for luxury accommodations. European aristocrats and businessmen crossing to America represented another steady stream of high-paying customers. Immigrants seeking new lives in America provided volume traffic that, while individually less profitable, generated substantial revenue in aggregate. Morgan calculated that the Olympic-class ships would not only dominate this market but expand it. By offering unprecedented luxury and reliability, he could charge premium prices while attracting new customers who had never before considered ocean travel. The ships would pay for themselves within a few years, and then generate enormous profits for decades to come. This was the dream. The reality, as we've seen, was somewhat different. When the Olympic collided with HMS Hawke in September 1911, Morgan's carefully calculated investment began to unravel. The ship that was supposed to be generating revenue was instead sitting in dry dock, requiring expensive repairs. Worse, the legal finding that the Olympic was at fault for the collision meant that insurance would not cover the costs of those repairs. But the problems went beyond just the immediate cost of fixing the damage. The Olympic's accident raised serious questions about the ship's design and safety. If one of these supposedly superior vessels could be so easily damaged in a collision with a smaller ship, what did that say about their construction? More importantly for Morgan's business model, what did it say about their insurability? Insurance was critical to the economics of ship operation. No shipping company could afford to operate vessels worth millions of dollars without comprehensive insurance coverage. But insurance companies were in the business of managing risk, and a ship that had already demonstrated vulnerability might be difficult to insure at reasonable rates. The switch theory suggests that by late 1911, Morgan and his associates realised they faced a potential disaster that went far beyond the cost of repairing one ship. If insurance companies began to question the safety and reliability of the Olympic-class design, it could affect the insurability and profitability of the entire fleet. The Titanic, still under construction, might face higher insurance premiums or coverage limitations based on her sister ship's problems. Even worse, if the Olympic's structural damage was more extensive than initially apparent, the ship might prove to be uneconomical to operate even after repairs. A ship with a damaged keel might suffer from ongoing problems with stability, fuel efficiency, or structural integrity. She might require more frequent and expensive maintenance, reducing her profitability and potentially shortening her operational life. In this context, the switch theory proposes the idea of swapping the ship's identities became attractive, not just as a way to collect insurance money, but as a way to solve multiple problems simultaneously. By sinking the damaged Olympic while disguised as the Titanic, the conspiracy would eliminate the problematic vessel, while collecting insurance payments based on the value of a new, undamaged ship. The insurance money would not only compensate for the Olympic's construction costs, but would also provide capital to complete the real Titanic and put her into profitable service. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now operating under the Olympic's identity, would begin generating revenue immediately. Any questions about the Olympic's performance could be explained away as improvements made during her repair period. The beauty of the plan, from a financial standpoint, was that it transformed a major liability into a substantial asset. Instead of losing money on repairs and operating a damaged ship of questionable profitability, the conspiracy would collect full insurance value for a total loss, while simultaneously putting an undamaged vessel into service. But for such a plan to work, the insurance aspects would need to be carefully managed. The Titanic was insured for £650,000, approximately $75 million in today's currency. This was a substantial amount, but it was less than the ship's actual construction cost, partly because insurance values were typically set below replacement cost to discourage fraudulent claims. However, the insurance money would still represent a significant recovery of Morgan's investment. Combined with the revenues that the real Titanic could generate while operating as the Olympic, the financial benefits of the switch could potentially exceed the total cost of both ships. The theory also suggests that the conspiracy would have additional financial benefits beyond the immediate insurance recovery. By eliminating the Olympic's problems, Morgan could proceed with his plans for the third sister ship, Britannic, without the cloud of questions about the class's design and safety. The successful maiden voyage of the Titanic would generate publicity and confidence that would benefit the entire White Star Line fleet. But perhaps most intriguingly, the switch theory proposes that the financial motive may have extended beyond simple insurance fraud. Some versions of the theory suggest that the disaster was timed to coincide with other events that would benefit Morgan's broader financial interests. In 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic disaster, the United States Federal Reserve System was established. This new central banking system fundamentally changed how American finance operated, and J.P. Morgan was one of its strongest supporters. The Federal Reserve centralized control of American monetary policy and created new opportunities for the kind of large-scale financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in. However, Morgan faced opposition to the Federal Reserve from some quarters, including wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. Some of these opponents happened to be aboard the Titanic when she sank. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune and a vocal critic of centralized banking, went down with the ship. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another Federal Reserve opponent, died along with his wife. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a skeptic of Morgan's financial schemes, also perished in the disaster. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan himself, who had booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, cancelled his trip at the last minute citing illness. Several of Morgan's business associates and political allies also cancelled their bookings while his opponents sailed to their deaths. This aspect of the theory suggests that the Titanic disaster may have served multiple purposes for Morgan. Not only did it solve his immediate problem with the Olympic and provide insurance money, but it also eliminated some of his most powerful opponents in the debate over American financial policy. Whether or not this political dimension was part of the original plan, the financial motive alone would have been sufficient to drive such a conspiracy. Morgan stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and he stood to gain millions if a carefully orchestrated disaster could eliminate his problems while collecting insurance payments. The amounts of money involved were so large that they could influence the decisions of governments and the fate of thousands of people. In the world of early 20th century finance, where a handful of men controlled wealth comparable to entire national budgets, the lives of 1,500 passengers might have seemed like acceptable collateral damage in service of a larger financial strategy. But money and motive alone do not prove a conspiracy. For the switch theory to be credible, there must be physical evidence that the ships were actually swapped. There must be documentation, photographs, and testimony that support the claim that the vessel that sank was not the Titanic but her damaged sister. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory claim that such evidence exists, hidden in plain sight in photographs, construction records, and the testimony of those who were present when the conspiracy was allegedly carried out. The human eye, they say, can be deceived. Photographs, however, do not lie. They capture reality with mechanical precision, preserving details that witnesses might forget or misremember. For proponents of the switch theory, photographic evidence forms the backbone of their case that the ship which sank on April 15th, 1912, was not the Titanic, but her sister ship, the Olympic. To understand this evidence, we must first appreciate just how similar the Olympic and Titanic actually were. Both ships were built from virtually identical blueprints, with the same overall dimensions, the same basic layout, and the same distinctive four-funnel profile. From a distance, even maritime experts would have difficulty distinguishing between them. However, they were not absolutely identical. The Titanic incorporated several design improvements based on experience gained from the Olympic's early service. More importantly, she included modifications specifically requested by passengers and crew who had sailed on the Olympic and identified areas for improvement. These differences, while minor, were distinctive enough that they could be identified by careful observers. And according to switch theory proponents, photographs of the ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, show features that match the Olympic rather than the Titanic. The most frequently cited difference involves the porthole arrangements on a deck, the ship's uppermost passenger deck. The original Titanic plans showed 16 portholes along the forward section of this deck. The Olympic, however, had been built with only 15 portholes in the same area. When the Olympic was being repaired after her collision with HMS Hawke, the damaged area included part of this porthole arrangement. Photographs taken of the Olympic during her repair period show workmen modifying the porthole configuration in this section. Switch theory proponents claim that these modifications were made to match the Titanic's 16 porthole design, as part of the process of disguising the Olympic as her sister ship. However, photographs of the ship that departed Southampton on the Titanic's supposed maiden voyage show only 15 portholes in the critical area, matching the Olympic's original configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned design. This discrepancy might seem minor, but it's precisely the kind of detail that would be difficult to alter quickly and completely. Changing porthole arrangements required cutting through the ship's steel hull and then reinforcing and refinishing the area. It was exactly the sort of modification that might be overlooked in a hasty effort to swap the ship's identities. Another frequently cited difference involves the arrangement of the ship's lifeboats. The Olympic and Titanic were built with slightly different davit systems, mechanical devices used to lower lifeboats into the water. The Titanic was designed with a newer, more efficient davit arrangement that allowed for quicker deployment of the boats. Photographs of the ship at Southampton show what appear to be the older style davits consistent with the Olympic's original configuration. Switch theory proponents argue that the newer davits planned for the Titanic were never installed because the ship that sailed was actually the disguised Olympic. This detail takes on additional significance when considered alongside survivor testimony about the difficulty experienced in launching lifeboats during the disaster. Several witnesses reported problems with the davit mechanisms, delays in getting boats into the water, and confusion about the operation of the launching equipment. If the ship was actually the Olympic with her old davit systems, such problems might explain some of the difficulties experienced during the evacuation. More controversial is evidence related to the ship's propeller systems. The Olympic suffered significant damage to her centre propeller shaft during the collision with HMS Hawke. Repairs to this system were complex and expensive, requiring removal and replacement of major components. Some switch theory proponents claim that rather than properly repairing the Olympic's propeller system, the damaged components were simply patched or temporarily fixed. They argue that the ship that sailed from Southampton had a compromised propulsion system that would have affected her handling and manoeuvrability. This claim is supported, they suggest, by testimony from passengers who noted that the ship seemed to vibrate unusually during the voyage, and by reports that the ship was not achieving her expected speed. If the Titanic was actually the Olympic with a damaged propeller system, these performance issues would be explained. Perhaps more significant than these technical details are the human testimonies from those who worked on the ships. Several workers at Harland and Wolff reported unusual activity during the winter months when both ships were in the shipyard together. James Fenton, a painter who worked on both vessels, later claimed that he noticed significant work being done to modify the Olympic during what was supposedly a routine repair period. According to Fenton, workers were making changes that seemed to go far beyond fixing collision damage. They were altering features of the ship that had nothing to do with the areas damaged in the Hawke incident. Fenton specifically mentioned work being done on the Olympic's passenger accommodations, including modifications to cabin layouts and public room configurations. He claimed that these changes seemed designed to make the Olympic more closely resemble the Titanic's interior arrangements. Even more intriguingly, Fenton reported that workers were instructed to swap various brass fittings and fixtures between the two ships. Nameplates, cabin numbers, and other identifying features were removed from both vessels and apparently switched. When Fenton asked supervisors about this work, he was told it was part of standardising equipment between the sister ships. Another shipyard worker, Robert Hichens, reported seeing unusual activity in the area where the ships' names were painted on their hulls. According to Hichens, the name plates and hull markings on both ships were removed and replaced during the repair period. He assumed this was routine maintenance, but later wondered whether something more significant was happening. Perhaps most compelling is testimony from John Halpin, a shipfitter who worked on both vessels. Halpin claimed that he was specifically assigned to work on swapping interior fittings between the Olympic and the ship under construction that was supposedly the Titanic. He was told that this was being done to upgrade the Olympic with improvements developed for her sister ship. However, Halpin noticed that the work seemed to go both ways. Features from the Olympic were also being installed on the other ship. When he questioned this, supervisors told him that they were standardising the designs to make maintenance and operation more efficient. Only years later, after the disaster, did Halpin begin to suspect that the work he'd been assigned might have been part of a larger deception. He realised that the extensive swapping of components between the ships could have been part of a process of switching their identities entirely. These worker testimonies are supported by documentary evidence from the shipyard. Harland and Wolff's work records from the winter of 1911 to 1912 show extensive modifications being made to both ships. While much of this work was clearly related to repairing the Olympic's collision damage, some entries describe tasks that seem unrelated to the repairs. For example, records show work being done on both ships' passenger cabin configurations, dining room layouts, and recreational facilities. This work is described in vague terms that make it difficult to determine exactly what was being done, but the volume of interior modification seems excessive for routine maintenance or repair work. More suspicious are gaps in the documentation. Several weeks' worth of work records are missing from the shipyard files, apparently lost or destroyed. The missing records cover precisely the period when the most extensive work was being done on both ships. Additionally, some surviving records contain unusual notations and corrections that suggest original entries were altered or replaced. Work orders that originally specified tasks for the Olympic appear to have been changed to specify the same work for the Titanic and vice versa. Switch theory proponents also point to photographic evidence from inside the ships. Comparison of interior photographs taken during construction with photographs taken aboard the ship that sailed from Southampton reveals several discrepancies. The most notable differences involve the first-class dining room and the grand staircase. The Olympics dining room was originally designed with a specific pattern of decorative panels and light fixtures. The Titanic was planned to have an improved version of the same space, with subtle but distinctive differences in the decorative scheme. Photographs taken aboard the ship at Southampton show decorative features that match the Olympics' original design, rather than the improvements planned for the Titanic. Similarly, details of the grand staircase appear to match the Olympics' configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned modifications. These interior discrepancies are particularly significant because they would be difficult to fake or alter after the disaster. Unlike exterior features that might be changed by salvage operations or natural deterioration, interior photographs taken before the voyage provide a permanent record of the ship's actual configuration. However, the most dramatic physical evidence cited by switch theory proponents involves the ship's construction numbers. Every vessel built by Harland and Wolff was assigned a unique yard number that was stamped or engraved on various components throughout the ship. These numbers served as permanent identification that could not be easily altered or forged. The Olympic was assigned yard number 301. The Titanic was assigned yard number 3909. According to the theory, components with the Olympic's number should have been found on the wreck if it was actually the Titanic that sank. When the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985, some of the recovered artifacts did indeed show construction numbers. However, examining these numbers has proven difficult due to the condition of the wreck and the limited access to recovered materials. Some switch theory proponents claim that construction numbers found on wreck components match the Olympic rather than the Titanic, but this claim is disputed by maritime historians and wreck researchers. The numbers are often partially obscured or damaged, making definitive identification difficult. More recently, some researchers have used advanced imaging techniques to examine construction details on the wreck itself. These studies have identified several features that appear to match the Olympic's configuration rather than the Titanic's planned design. For example, the propeller arrangement on the wreck appears to show evidence of the repair work done to the Olympic's damaged propulsion system. The centre propeller, which should have been a 3-blade design on the Titanic, appears to be a 4-blade configuration that matches repairs made to the Olympic. Similarly, hull plates in areas that should have been newly constructed for the Titanic show evidence of previous damage and repair that would be consistent with the Olympic's collision damage. However, these findings are highly technical and disputed by many experts. The condition of the wreck after more than a century on the ocean floor makes definitive identification of small details extremely difficult. Corrosion, collapse, and damage from the sinking itself have obscured many of the features that might provide conclusive evidence. The physical evidence for the switch theory remains controversial and disputed. While proponents point to numerous discrepancies between the ship that sailed and the ship that was supposed to sail, skeptics argue that these differences can be explained by changes made during construction, errors in documentation, or misinterpretation of photographic evidence. What is not disputed is that significant work was done on both ships during the winter of 1911 to 1912, that modifications were made that went beyond simple repair work, and that there are photographic and documentary discrepancies that have never been fully explained. Whether these discrepancies prove a conspiracy or simply reflect the normal complexities of building and modifying massive ships remains a matter of debate. But for switch theory proponents, the physical evidence forms a compelling case that something was not right about the ship that sailed from Southampton on that April morning in 1912. However, physical evidence is only part of the story. To truly understand the scope of the alleged conspiracy, we must examine not just what was done to the ships, but who was aboard them. The passenger list of the Titanic's final voyage contains names that would reshape the world of finance and politics, and according to the theory, this was no coincidence. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what happened, but who was present when it happened. In the case of the Titanic disaster, The passenger manifest reads like a who's who of early 20th century power and influence. But according to the switch theory, this prestigious passenger list was not assembled by chance. Instead, it was carefully curated to serve the purposes of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. To understand the significance of the Titanic's passengers, we must first understand the broader context of American politics and finance in 1912. The United States was on the verge of fundamental changes in how its financial system operated. The country had experienced several financial panics in recent decades, and there was growing pressure to create a more stable and centralized banking system. J.P. Morgan and his allies favored the creation of a central bank that would be controlled by major financial institutions. This system, which would eventually become the Federal Reserve, would give unprecedented power to a small group of bankers and financiers. They would control the nation's money supply, interest rates, and credit availability. However, this plan faced significant opposition from wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. These opponents feared that a central bank controlled by Morgan and his associates would concentrate too much financial power in too few hands. They argued for maintaining a system where multiple independent banks could compete and where no single institution could dominate the nation's finances. The debate over banking reform was not merely academic. Billions of dollars in wealth and decades of political power hung in the balance. If Morgan's vision prevailed, he and his allies would control the financial destiny of the United States. If his opponents succeeded in blocking the plan, Morgan's influence would be significantly diminished. Into this high-stakes political battle sailed the Titanic, carrying some of the most influential participants in the banking debate. And remarkably, almost all of the Federal Reserve's most powerful opponents happened to be aboard, while Morgan and his supporters were conspicuously absent. The most prominent opponent aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. The Guggenheim family controlled vast mineral resources and had accumulated enormous wealth through copper, silver and gold mining operations around the world. Benjamin was not just wealthy but politically influential, serving on the boards of multiple corporations and maintaining extensive connections in Washington. Guggenheim had been a vocal critic of Morgan's banking proposals. He argued that a centralized system would stifle competition and innovation in American finance. He favored maintaining the existing system of independent banks and opposed giving any single institution the power to control the nation's money supply. On the night of April 14th, as the Titanic began to sink, Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly dressed in his finest evening clothes and told fellow passengers, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body was never recovered. Also aboard was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another influential voice in American business. Straus had built his retail empire through careful management and conservative financial practices. He distrusted the kind of financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in and opposed the creation of a central bank that would facilitate such practices. Straus was particularly concerned about the impact of centralized banking on smaller businesses. He argued that a Morgan-controlled central bank would favor large corporations at the expense of independent merchants and entrepreneurs. His opposition to the Federal Reserve plan was well known in political circles. When the Titanic began to sink, Isidore and his wife Ida were offered places in a lifeboat. According to witnesses, Ada refused to leave her husband, saying, "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship tilted toward her final plunge. Neither body was ever found. Perhaps most significant was the presence of John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a man whose financial influence rivaled Morgan's own. Astor had inherited a vast real estate empire and had expanded it into hotels, railroads, and other investments. His personal fortune was estimated at over $87 million, roughly $2 billion in today's currency. Astor was not merely wealthy, but politically sophisticated. He understood the implications of Morgan's banking proposals and opposed them on both economic and political grounds. He argued that giving Morgan's group control over the nation's banking system would create a financial oligarchy that would undermine American democratic institutions. More than any other individual, Astor had the wealth and influence to effectively oppose Morgan's plans. His opposition carried weight in Congress and in the financial community. If anyone could have blocked the creation of the Federal Reserve, it was John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was travelling on the Titanic with his pregnant young wife, Madeline. When the ship began to sink, he helped her into a lifeboat but was refused passage himself under the Women and Children First protocol. His body was recovered days later, reportedly with his gold watch still in his pocket and over $2,000 in cash. His death eliminated one of the most powerful obstacles to Morgan's banking ambitions. These three men, Guggenheim, Strauss and Astor, represented the core of wealthy American opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan. Their combined influence, both financial and political, posed a serious threat to Morgan's vision of centralised banking control. Their deaths removed major obstacles to the passage of Federal Reserve legislation. But the passenger list's significance extends beyond these three prominent figures. Several other Titanic passengers had connections to the banking debate or to Morgan's business interests. Some were allies who might have provided testimony or support that could have been problematic for the conspiracy. Others were neutral parties whose presence might have been seen as providing legitimacy to the voyage. The theory suggests that the passenger list was carefully managed to ensure that the right people were aboard and the wrong people were not. Key figures in the banking debate who opposed Morgan were encouraged or induced to sail, while those who might have interfered with the plan were kept away. This management allegedly extended to the crew assignments as well. Captain Edward Smith, who commanded the ship, was nearing retirement, and may have been chosen partly because his career was ending anyway. If he survived the disaster, he would soon be out of the shipping business and less likely to cause problems. If he didn't survive, his death would be seen as a heroic sacrifice rather than evidence of conspiracy. Other key crew members were reportedly chosen for their loyalty to the White Star Line or their lack of detailed knowledge about the ship's construction. Engineers and officers who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic were either not assigned to the voyage or were placed in positions where they would be unlikely to survive if something went wrong. Perhaps most tellingly, J.P. Morgan himself had originally booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage. As the owner of the shipping line and the man whose vision the voyage was meant to showcase, Morgan's presence would have been expected and appropriate. His cabin had been reserved, his passage confirmed, and his attendance at various social events planned. But at the last minute, Morgan cancelled his trip, citing illness. He claimed to be suffering from a minor ailment that prevented him from travelling, and he remained in France where he had been vacationing. Remarkably, several of Morgan's close business associates also cancelled their bookings at the last minute, citing various personal and business reasons. The pattern of cancellations was so notable that it attracted attention even at the time. Several newspapers commented on the unusual number of prominent businessmen who had changed their travel plans. Some observers wondered whether there might have been advance warning of problems with the ship or the voyage. Morgan's cancellation is particularly suspicious because he was photographed in apparently good health at a French resort just days after the disaster. He showed no signs of the illness that had supposedly prevented him from travelling, and he resumed his normal activities immediately after learning of the Titanic's fate. Even more suspicious were the cancellations by Morgan's business partners. Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate and longtime Morgan ally, had booked passage but cancelled, citing his wife's health. George Washington Vanderbilt II, another Morgan associate, also cancelled his booking at the last minute. Milton Hershey, the chocolate manufacturer who had business relationships with Morgan's interests, similarly changed his travel plans. The pattern suggests that Morgan and his inner circle knew something that the general passengers did not. Whether they had advanced knowledge of the planned disaster, or simply knew that the ship was not safe due to the identity switch, they took steps to avoid being aboard when the conspiracy was carried out. Meanwhile, Morgan's opponents in the banking debate sailed to their deaths, apparently unaware of the danger they faced. The convenient elimination of the Federal Reserve's most powerful critics cleared the way for the legislation that Morgan had been promoting. Indeed, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in December 1913, less than 2 years after the Titanic disaster. The legislation created the central banking system that Morgan had long advocated, giving him and his associates unprecedented control over American finance. The deaths of Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss had removed the most influential voices that might have prevented this outcome. Some versions of the switch theory go even further, suggesting that the passenger list was managed not just to eliminate political opponents, but also to provide witnesses who would support the official story of the disaster. Certain passengers and crew members who survived the sinking provided testimony that reinforced the narrative of an accidental collision with an iceberg. These survivors described the impact, the flooding, and the sinking in ways that supported the insurance claims and deflected suspicion from the possibility of sabotage or deliberate destruction. Their accounts helped establish the official version of events that has persisted for over a century. However, other survivors provided testimony that was less helpful to the official narrative. Some reported hearing explosions before the ship began to sink, suggesting possible sabotage. Others described unusual behaviour by crew members or problems with the ship's equipment that might have indicated advanced planning of the disaster. These problematic testimonies were reportedly suppressed or discredited during the official investigations. Survivors who told inconvenient stories found their credibility questioned or their testimony excluded from the final reports. The investigation focused on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures rather than examining the possibility of deliberate destruction. The passenger list evidence is compelling but circumstantial. The coincidence of having so many Federal Reserve opponents aboard while Morgan and his allies stayed away is remarkable, but it could be explained by factors other than conspiracy. The timing of the banking legislation might have been influenced by the victims' deaths, but correlation does not necessarily prove causation. However, when combined with the physical evidence and the financial motives, the passenger list adds another layer to the case for the switch theory. The pattern of who was aboard and who wasn't suggests a level of planning and coordination that goes beyond simple insurance fraud. If the theory is correct, the Titanic disaster was not just about swapping damaged ships or collecting insurance money. It was about reshaping the American financial system and eliminating opposition to a plan that would concentrate enormous power in the hands of a few men. But such an ambitious conspiracy would require more than just manipulating passenger lists and switching ships. It would require control over the disaster itself, ensuring that the sinking occurred under circumstances that would support the official story while achieving the conspiracy's goals. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory believe that every aspect of the sinking was carefully planned and executed. The final act of any great conspiracy must be the most carefully orchestrated. If the switch theory is correct, then the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 represented not a tragic accident, but the culmination of months of planning designed to create the appearance of disaster while achieving very specific goals. Every detail of how the ship encountered the iceberg, how she sank, and how the rescue efforts unfolded would need to serve the larger purpose of the conspiracy. To understand how the sinking might have been deliberately orchestrated, we must first examine the unusual circumstances that made the disaster possible. The night of April 14th was characterised by conditions that maritime experts describe as extraordinarily rare and dangerous. The sea was unusually calm, so still that there were no waves breaking against icebergs to make them visible from a distance. The night was moonless, creating darkness so complete that lookouts had virtually no natural illumination to aid their watch. Most unusually, the atmosphere was clear and cold, creating temperature inversion conditions that could cause unusual optical effects, making distant objects appear closer or farther than they actually were. These conditions, while natural, were so unusual that many experienced sailors reported they had never encountered anything like them. Captain Smith himself, with 4 decades of experience on the North Atlantic, had never commanded a ship through such treacherous natural circumstances. But according to the switch theory, these conditions were not just unfortunate coincidences. They were anticipated and exploited by conspirators who had carefully planned the ship's route and timing to take advantage of known dangerous conditions. The theory suggests that the ship's course was deliberately set to take her through areas where icebergs were known to be present. Radio warnings about ice had been received throughout the day, but many of these warnings were reportedly not passed to the bridge crew. or were ignored by officers who should have taken precautionary measures. The ship Californian, which belonged to the same parent company as the Titanic, had stopped for the night in the ice field, her captain declaring conditions too dangerous for navigation. Yet the Titanic continued at nearly full speed through the same waters, despite multiple warnings about the presence of ice. Switch theory proponents argue that this dangerous navigation was not the result of overconfidence or poor judgment, but rather deliberate policy designed to ensure that an accident would occur. The ship needed to encounter an iceberg in order to provide a plausible explanation for her sinking, and her officers were instructed to maintain course and speed despite the obvious dangers. The collision itself occurred under circumstances that some witnesses found suspicious. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, reported that the berg appeared suddenly out of the darkness, giving him only seconds to sound the alarm. However, other witnesses reported seeing the iceberg minutes before the collision, suggesting that it should have been visible to trained lookouts much earlier. Some survivors reported that the ship seemed to turn toward the iceberg rather than away from it in the final moments before impact. While this could be explained by the physics of large ship manoeuvring, it raises questions about whether the collision was truly accidental or was deliberately engineered to ensure maximum damage. More suspicious were reports of explosions aboard the ship shortly after the collision. Multiple witnesses, including passengers and crew members, reported hearing loud bangs and feeling vibrations that seemed separate from the impact with the iceberg. These explosions were officially attributed to boilers bursting as cold water flooded the engine rooms, but some witnesses believed they occurred too soon after the collision to be explained by flooding alone. The switch theory suggests that these explosions may have been caused by deliberately placed charges designed to ensure that the ship would sink quickly and completely. If the collision with the iceberg was not sufficient to guarantee the ship's destruction, additional sabotage might have been necessary to achieve the conspiracy's goals. The pattern of flooding also struck some observers as unusual. While the official investigation concluded that the iceberg had opened 5 compartments to the sea, causing fatal flooding, some witnesses reported that water seemed to be entering the ship from multiple locations, not just the area of the supposed iceberg damage. Crew members working in areas far from the collision reported rapid flooding that seemed inconsistent with damage caused by scraping along an iceberg. Some suggested that the ship's hull might have been weakened in advance, either through the supposed identity switch or through deliberate sabotage, making her more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. The behaviour of some crew members during the disaster also raised questions. While many officers and crew performed heroically, trying to save as many passengers as possible, others seemed strangely unprepared for the emergency or reluctant to take action that might have saved more lives. The ship's wireless operators continued sending routine commercial messages even after the collision, delaying distress calls that might have brought rescue ships more quickly. Some officers seemed confused about the severity of the damage or uncertain about proper emergency procedures, suggesting that they might not have been fully briefed on the ship's actual condition or capabilities. Most suspiciously, the ship's lifeboats were launched with far fewer passengers than their capacity allowed. While this was officially attributed to panic and poor training, some witnesses reported that crew members actively prevented passengers from entering boats that had space available. The switch theory suggests that this was not incompetence but deliberate policy designed to ensure that specific passengers would not survive. If the conspiracy's goal was to eliminate certain individuals while allowing others to live, controlling access to lifeboats would be an effective method of determining who lived and who died. The nearby ship Californian adds another layer of suspicion to the night's events. This vessel, owned by the same International Mercantile Marine Company that controlled the White Star Line, had stopped for the night approximately 20 miles from the Titanic's position. Her captain, Stanley Lord, claimed that conditions were too dangerous for navigation and that his ship would remain stationary until dawn. However, the Californian's crew reported seeing rockets and distress signals from the direction of the Titanic throughout the night. Despite these obvious signs of a ship in distress, Captain Lord chose not to investigate or offer assistance. He claimed that he believed the signals were routine communications or celebrations, not emergency distress calls. This explanation seems implausible given that the Californian's crew were experienced sailors who should have recognised distress rockets when they saw them. The switch theory suggests that the Californian was positioned deliberately to provide rescue services for the conspiracy's chosen survivors while maintaining plausible deniability about why she didn't help the others. According to this theory, the Californian was meant to arrive at the scene early enough to rescue specific passengers, but late enough to allow the ship to sink and eliminate the unwanted victims. However, a miscommunication or timing error prevented this plan from working properly, leaving the Californian too far away to effectively participate in the rescue. Instead, the rescue was carried out by the Carpathia, a ship belonging to a different company that responded to the Titanic's distress calls and arrived at the scene several hours after the sinking. The Carpathia's captain and crew were not part of the conspiracy and performed genuine rescue work, saving over 700 survivors. But the delay in rescue efforts, whether planned or accidental, ensured that the ship sank completely and that most of her passengers and crew died in the frigid waters. This served the conspiracy's purposes by eliminating witnesses who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic, while also removing the political opponents whose deaths were part of the larger plan. The sinking itself was remarkably complete and thorough. Unlike many shipwrecks, which settle on the ocean floor largely intact, the Titanic broke apart as she sank, scattering debris over a wide area and making subsequent examination of the wreck extremely difficult. This destruction could have been the result of natural forces acting on a ship not designed to sink at such an angle, but it also served to obscure evidence that might have revealed the ship's true identity. The complete loss of the ship meant that investigators had to rely on survivor testimony and limited physical evidence to reconstruct what had happened. Since many of the most knowledgeable witnesses had died in the disaster, and since the survivors had been through a traumatic experience that might have affected their memories, establishing definitive facts about the sinking proved difficult. This uncertainty served the conspiracy's purposes by preventing too close an examination of the evidence. Questions about the ship's identity, the cause of the sinking, or the behaviour of the crew could be deflected by pointing to the lack of conclusive evidence and the confusion inherent in any major disaster. The official investigations that followed the disaster focused primarily on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures. While these investigations identified important problems with lifeboat capacity, crew training and emergency procedures, they did not seriously examine the possibility that the sinking had been deliberately caused. The British Board of Trade Inquiry and the US Senate investigation both concluded that the disaster was the result of excessive speed in dangerous conditions, combined with design flaws that made the ship vulnerable to the type of damage caused by the iceberg collision. These findings supported the official narrative of an accidental tragedy, while deflecting attention from possible evidence of conspiracy. However, some evidence presented to these investigations was inconsistent with the official conclusions. Witnesses testified about explosions, unusual flooding patterns, and crew behaviour that suggested advanced knowledge of the disaster. This testimony was generally dismissed or explained away, but it remained part of the official record for those who knew where to look for it. The investigations also revealed suspicious gaps in the documentary evidence. Ship logs, construction records, and other documents that might have provided definitive information about the vessel's identity or condition were missing or had been destroyed. While this was officially attributed to the chaos of the disaster, it prevented investigators from definitively establishing key facts about the ship and her voyage. Perhaps most tellingly, the investigations made no serious attempt to examine the financial aspects of the disaster. The insurance arrangements, the ownership structure of the shipping companies, and the business relationships between key figures were not considered relevant to understanding why the ship sank. This focus on technical rather than financial questions served the conspiracy's purposes by avoiding examination of the motives that might have driven such an elaborate deception. The investigations treated the disaster as a tragic accident rather than a possible crime, and their conclusions reinforced the official narrative that has persisted for over a century. But if the switch theory is correct, the sinking of the Titanic was not just a crime but a nearly perfect crime. The destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and the misdirection of official investigations created a cover-up so complete that the truth has remained hidden for more than 100 years. As we'll see in the next chapter, maintaining this cover-up required ongoing efforts by powerful interests to suppress evidence, discredit investigators, and control the historical narrative of the disaster. In the aftermath of any major conspiracy, the cover-up often proves more challenging than the original crime. Evidence must be suppressed, witnesses must be silenced or discredited, and investigators must be misdirected away from uncomfortable truths. If the switch theory is correct, the years following the Titanic disaster saw one of the most comprehensive and successful cover-ups in modern history. The cover-up began almost immediately after news of the disaster reached shore. Within hours of the Carpathia's arrival in New York with the Titanic survivors, powerful interests were already working to control the narrative of what had happened and to prevent inconvenient questions from being asked. J.P. Morgan's representatives were among the first to arrive at the dock, not to provide comfort to survivors, but to begin the process of managing information. Survivors were reportedly approached by company officials and lawyers who offered assistance with travel arrangements, medical care and financial support. However, this assistance came with subtle but clear expectations about what survivors should and should not say about their experiences. Some survivors later reported being advised to focus their testimony on the heroism of the crew and the tragedy of insufficient lifeboats, while avoiding speculation about the cause of the disaster or unusual circumstances they might have observed. Those who had noticed discrepancies between the ship they boarded and the ship they expected to board were encouraged to attribute these differences to their own confusion or lack of technical knowledge. More direct pressure was reportedly applied to survivors whose testimony might have been particularly damaging to the official narrative. Crew members who had worked on both the Olympic and Titanic and might have been able to identify which ship actually sank were offered generous severance packages and assistance finding new employment, with the understanding that their maritime careers would be over if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The most dangerous witnesses were those who had observed the supposed identity switch taking place in the Belfast shipyard. These workers faced more serious consequences if they chose to speak out. Some reported being visited by company representatives who made it clear that their employment, their safety, and the welfare of their families depended on their discretion. James Fenton, the painter who had noticed unusual modifications being made to the Olympic, later claimed that he was approached by men who warned him that discussing his observations would be considered a breach of his employment contract and potentially a criminal violation of trade secrets laws. He was told that speaking to journalists or investigators could result in prosecution and imprisonment. Other shipyard workers reported similar intimidation. Some were offered money to relocate to distant cities where they would be less likely to encounter investigators or journalists. Others were simply fired from their jobs and found that their names had been blacklisted throughout the shipbuilding industry, making it impossible for them to find similar work. The most comprehensive aspect of the cover-up involved the systematic destruction or alteration of documentary evidence. Harland and Wolff shipyard records that might have revealed the true extent of work done on both ships were reportedly destroyed in a series of accidental fires and floods that occurred in the months following the disaster. Work orders, progress reports, and material requisitions that could have definitively established which ship was which were among the documents lost in these convenient accidents. The missing records covered precisely the time period when the alleged identity switch would have taken place, eliminating the most direct evidence of the conspiracy. More subtly, surviving documents were reportedly altered to remove inconvenient details or to create confusion about the timeline of work done on both ships. Serial numbers were changed, dates were altered, and work descriptions were modified to obscure the true nature of the modifications that had been made. The British Board of Trade Investigation, which was the primary official inquiry into the disaster, showed unusual patterns in how it gathered and evaluated evidence. The investigation focused almost exclusively on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures, while avoiding examination of financial motives or business relationships that might have suggested conspiracy. Key witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony were not called to testify. or their testimony was limited to narrow technical questions that avoided broader issues about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the voyage. The investigation's final report contained numerous conclusions that were not fully supported by the evidence presented, suggesting that the outcomes had been predetermined. Even more suspicious was the speed with which the investigation was concluded and its findings accepted by government authorities. For a disaster of such magnitude and complexity, the investigation was remarkably brief and superficial. Important questions were left unanswered, and significant discrepancies in witness testimony were ignored or explained away without adequate investigation. The US Senate investigation, led by Senator William Alden Smith, initially appeared more thorough and independent. Senator Smith was known for his skepticism of large corporations and his willingness to challenge powerful interests. His investigation called numerous witnesses and examined many aspects of the disaster that the British inquiry had ignored. However, as the investigation proceeded, it became apparent that Senator Smith was facing pressure from influential sources to limit the scope of his inquiry. Key witnesses were suddenly unavailable or changed their testimony between preliminary interviews and formal hearings. Documentary evidence that had been promised to the investigation failed to materialise or was found to be incomplete. Most tellingly, the investigation avoided examining the financial aspects of the disaster. Despite the enormous insurance claims involved and the clear financial benefits that accrued to certain parties, the investigation treated these as irrelevant side issues rather than potential motives for conspiracy. The final report of the Senate investigation contained strong criticisms of White Star Line's safety procedures and British maritime regulations, but it concluded that the disaster was fundamentally accidental. Like the British inquiry, it avoided any suggestion that the sinking might have been deliberately caused, or that there might have been financial motives behind the tragedy. In the years following the official investigations, efforts to independently examine the disaster faced systematic obstruction. Journalists who attempted to investigate discrepancies in the official story found their sources drying up and their access to information restricted. Maritime historians who raised questions about the disaster's circumstances found their work discredited or their employment threatened. Perhaps most remarkably, several independent investigators who had begun to uncover evidence supporting the switch theory died under suspicious circumstances. Some died in apparent accidents, others from sudden illnesses, and still others simply disappeared while pursuing their research. Robert Hitchens, the shipyard worker who had observed unusual activity around the ship's nameplates, died in a fall from scaffolding while working on another project less than a year after the disaster. The accident occurred despite Hitchens' reputation as an experienced and safety-conscious worker who had never before been injured on the job. John Halpern, the ship fitter who had worked on swapping components between the Olympic and Titanic, died of a sudden heart attack despite being relatively young and having no history of heart problems. His death occurred just days before he was scheduled to be interviewed by an American journalist who was investigating discrepancies in the official story. Several other shipyard workers who had knowledge of the construction process died in various accidents or from sudden illnesses in the years immediately following the disaster. While these deaths could be coincidental, the pattern suggests a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony. The cover-up also extended to controlling the physical evidence from the disaster. When bodies were recovered from the ocean, they were processed through facilities controlled by White Star Line representatives. Personal effects were catalogued and returned to families, but items that might have provided clues about the ship's true identity were reportedly lost or misdirected. More significantly, efforts were made to prevent independent examination of the wreck site. In the early decades after the disaster, technology did not exist to reach the wreck on the ocean floor, but White Star Line and its successors took steps to ensure that when such technology became available, access to the wreck would be controlled. Legal claims were filed asserting ownership rights over the wreck and its contents. These claims were designed to prevent independent researchers from examining the evidence without permission from the companies that had controlled the ships. By controlling access to the wreck, these interests could ensure that any examination would be conducted under their supervision and that inconvenient findings could be suppressed. The most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up involved shaping the cultural memory of the disaster. Rather than simply suppressing evidence, the conspiracy's beneficiaries actively promoted a specific narrative about the Titanic that emphasized heroism, tragedy, and the lessons learned about maritime safety. Books, articles, and eventually films about the disaster focused on human interest stories, rather than technical questions about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the sinking. The narrative of the brave band playing hymns as the ship sank, of the noble sacrifice of men who gave their lives so that women and children could survive, and of the hubris of calling any ship unsinkable became the dominant cultural memory of the disaster.